The lens moves slowly across the jagged edge of a fallen pillar. Stone, once smoothed by master hands, now crumbles into coarse sand under the relentless pressure of centuries. Every crack in the surface tells a story of structural collapse, of weight shifting until the foundation finally gave way. There is no wind here. The air remains perfectly still, trapped within these hollowed walls like a held breath. A single, narrow shaft of sunlight cuts through the gloom from a fracture in the ceiling high above. Within that beam, millions of dust motes drift in a chaotic, rhythmic dance. They settle on the uneven floor, coating the debris in a fine gray veil. The light reveals the depth of the erosion, highlighting the porous, pitted texture of the masonry. It is a space defined by absence. The structures that once stood here have been reclaimed by the slow, grinding process of time. Silence dominates the chamber, heavy and absolute, broken only by the faint, dry sound of grit shifting as the ruins continue their inevitable descent into total decay. Nothing moves except the dust. Nothing changes except the slow, steady erosion of the stone. This is the stage where the past refuses to be forgotten. The silence of the ruins is not empty. It carries a frequency that predates the stone itself. Listen closely to the stillness, and you will hear the echoes of a recurring dread. These are not merely stories told to frighten the gullible. They are the whispers of the end, a persistent hum vibrating through the bedrock of every civilization. Across millennia, the same fear has surfaced in the shadow of plague, in the deafening roar of war, and in the sudden tremor of social collapse. It is a primal, unshakable conviction that the world is perpetually on the brink of its final hour. Humanity has carried this burden through every age, refining the language of the apocalypse to suit the terrors of the time. These predictions do not die when the expected date passes. They simply retreat, waiting for the next moment of instability to sharpen their edge. It is a cycle that refuses to break, a collective memory of endings that humanity keeps alive, generation after generation. The focus shifts from the vast, empty landscape to a singular, heavy object resting on a stone plinth. It is an aged book, bound in dark, cracked leather that feels cold to the touch. A hand enters the frame, fingers covered in thin, tight material, and moves with a calculated, rhythmic precision. The hand grips the edge of the cover, the leather groaning under the pressure of years of disuse. As the cover lifts, the smell of dry rot and ancient ink fills the space. The pages are brittle, yellowed, and thin as dried leaves. They crackle softly, a sound like breaking glass, as the hand turns them one by one. Each page reveals dense, cramped handwriting surrounding intricate, disturbing illustrations. These are not merely drawings. They are visual records of catastrophe. The camera lingers on a depiction of a sky split by fire, the ink dark and jagged. The lines are sharp, conveying a frantic energy that defies the stillness of the room. The hand pauses, a gloved finger tracing the outline of a crumbling city, then flips to the next page. The book is heavy with the weight of its own contents. The book is not the end of the inquiry. It is merely the beginning of a deeper, more persistent mystery. Why do these visions of the end return, generation after generation, with such relentless consistency? We look at the failed dates, the discredited prophets, and the empty promises of catastrophe, yet the warnings never fully disappear. They merely wait. They hibernate in the collective consciousness, ready to surface the moment the ground beneath society begins to shift. This is the central question. Why does humanity cling to the idea of its own termination? Is it a byproduct of our inherent fear of the unknown, or does the prophecy serve a darker, more functional purpose? We find that these visions gain strength during periods of intense instability, acting as a mirror for our current anxieties. They are not merely predictions of the future, they are reflections of the present. By the end of this journey, the pattern will become clear. We will uncover how fear provides the oxygen for these ideas to breathe. The inquiry moves from the pages of a book to the dust of the first cities. We step back thousands of years to the cradle of civilization, where the first permanent records of human anxiety were formed. The camera pans across the ruins of an ancient metropolis, the stone walls worn smooth by wind and time. These were the first structures to challenge the wilderness, and with them came the first structured fears of their collapse. In the heart of these cities, scribes pressed reeds into wet clay, creating cuneiform marks that would outlast the very empires they served. These tablets were not just records of grain harvests or legal codes. They were the first attempts to codify the unpredictable. When the river flooded or the crops withered, the response was not merely to rebuild, but to record the event as a sign of something greater. The act of pressing a stylus into clay transformed a fleeting disaster into a permanent, repeatable warning. The tablets reveal more than just the logistics of survival. They document a profound shift in how the ancients processed the world around them. When the sky darkened with ash, or the rivers breached their banks, the scribe did not merely record the destruction. He looked for a cause, and in the absence of scientific explanation, he found it in the divine. The cuneiform lines detail a direct correlation. The drought was not just a lack of rain, but a withdrawal of favor. The earthquake was not a tectonic shift, but a tremor of celestial anger. This was the birth of the omen. By linking the physical catastrophe to a moral or spiritual failure, the ancients transformed random, chaotic events into a coherent narrative of punishment. They began to read the natural world as a text, where every storm and every blight served as a warning of impending judgment. This interpretation provided a sense of control, however fragile. If the disaster was a response to human behavior, then the disaster could be managed or averted through ritual and sacrifice. The tablets show us that as soon as humanity built its first walls, it began to fear the forces that might tear them down, framing every threat as a direct consequence of its own existence. The focus shifts from the dry, sun-baked clay of the ancient world to the damp, crowded streets of the Middle Ages. Here, the fear of the end ceased to be a matter of interpreting distant omens and became a daily, suffocating reality. The scale of human anxiety expanded. It was no longer just a city watching its river. It was an entire continent watching its foundations crumble. War became a permanent fixture of the horizon, and the arrival of the plague turned the threat of extinction into a visceral, physical presence. In this era, every bell tolling in the distance was heard as a funeral knell for the world itself. The medieval mind did not look for signs in the stars alone. It found them in the rotting crops, the sudden silence of abandoned villages, and the relentless march of armies across borders. The fear was no longer a philosophical exercise. It was a pulse, beating in the throat of every person who lived through the uncertainty of the age. When the plague arrived, it did not just kill. It validated every dark prophecy. The end was no longer a distant possibility. It was knocking at the door. The arrival of the plague transformed the medieval city into a landscape of silence and frantic movement. It did not discriminate between the powerful and the destitute, and that lack of order was the true catalyst for the apocalyptic panic. When the first swellings appeared, the standard mechanisms of society simply stopped. Markets emptied. The tolling of bells for the dead became a constant, rhythmic background noise that eventually ceased because there were too few left to ring them. People retreated behind locked doors, yet the sickness followed, turning homes into tombs. This physical reality of decay and isolation shattered the collective confidence in the future. As the bodies accumulated in the streets, the logic of the world shifted from survival to finality. The social contract dissolved under the weight of the dying. In the absence of authority, the only remaining framework for understanding the catastrophe was the prophecy. The physical collapse of the city provided the final, undeniable evidence that the era of humanity was drawing to a close. As the physical world crumbled, the vacuum of authority was filled by those who claimed to hold the keys to the afterlife. Religious leaders recognized that fear was a potent currency, and they began to mint it in the pulpits of every town square. They did not merely observe the decay, they curated it. They stood before the starving and the sick, framing the catastrophe, not as a random biological event, but as a direct, divine judgment against the sins of the living. This rhetoric transformed the aimless panic of the masses into a focused, desperate devotion, leaders organized massive processions, demanding public displays of penance that effectively funneled the collective anxiety into rigid, controllable channels. If the world was ending, they argued, then the only path to salvation was through absolute obedience to the church. They mobilized the desperate to purge perceived heretics, turning the fear of the apocalypse into a weapon of social purification. The grip of the pulpit began to loosen as the eyes of the world turned upward. Where once the end was written in the sins of the heart, it was now increasingly sought in the cold, silent movements of the heavens. Astronomers and mathematicians replaced the clergy as the new architects of dread. They pointed their lenses at the stars and found not a divine order, but a chaotic, indifferent clockwork that seemed to tick toward a final, singular collision. The comet became the new harbinger. Its sudden, jagged streak across the night sky did not require a sermon to incite terror. It was a visible, undeniable anomaly that defied the established laws of the universe. This was the dawn of the secular apocalypse. People began to fear the alignment of planets and the trajectory of celestial bodies, viewing the cosmos as a vast, mechanical threat rather than a moral stage. The dread shifted from the internal to the external, from the soul to the vacuum of space. By stripping away the need for a divine judge, these new predictions felt more dangerous, more inevitable, and entirely beyond human intervention. The fear was no longer about penance. It was about the crushing weight of physics. The true catalyst for the modern apocalypse was not a celestial event, but a mechanical one. When the printing press emerged, it broke the monopoly of the elite over the narrative of the end. Suddenly, a single, frantic vision of doom could be replicated thousands of times over, flooding the streets with cheap, terrifying pamphlets. These were the first viral sensations of history. They bypassed the slow, deliberate vetting of the church and landed directly in the hands of the illiterate and the desperate. A printer in a distant city could draft a warning about a coming fire or a demonic plague, and within weeks, that fear would be circulating in the markets of a dozen countries. The speed of the press created a new kind of urgency. It turned isolated, local anxieties into a synchronized cross-border panic. This was the birth of the information age, and it was baptized in the language of the end. The press did not just report on the apocalypse, it manufactured it. Fear became a commodity, mass-produced and distributed to every corner of the map, forever changing how humanity consumed the prospect of its own destruction. The calendar became a weapon. Prophets and mathematicians circled specific dates in red ink, declaring them the final boundary of human history. Thousands gathered on hillsides or locked their doors, waiting for the sky to tear open or the earth to split. They watched the clock tick toward midnight with a terrifying absolute certainty. Then, the sun rose, the birds sang, the world remained stubbornly, annoyingly intact. This was the moment of the great collision between prophecy and reality. The initial reaction was not relief. It was a profound, disorienting silence. People stood in the streets, looking at their neighbors, waiting for a catastrophe that refused to manifest. Confusion rippled through the crowds as the reality of the morning light set in. Some wept, others stared at the horizon in disbelief. But the most dangerous reaction was the immediate pivot to denial. Before the day was out, the excuses began. A miscalculation in the lunar cycle, a forgotten leap year, a hidden variable in the ancient texts. The failure was not treated as a mistake, but as a test of faith. They adjusted the math, moved the date forward, and resumed the vigil. The date was wrong, but the fear remained perfectly, dangerously alive. The most brutal collapse occurred in the quiet aftermath of a failed prophecy. A prominent leader had gathered his followers on a barren field, promising that the heavens would open at dawn. They had sold their homes and abandoned their livelihoods, standing in the cold, waiting for a salvation that never arrived. When the sun climbed high and the world remained unchanged, the atmosphere shifted from electric anticipation to suffocating shame. The leader stood before them, his voice trembling as he tried to reframe the silence of the sky as a divine mystery. But The followers were no longer listening. The spell had broken. They looked at their empty hands and realized the magnitude of what they had sacrificed. Then came the true punishment, the return to a world that had been watching them with ridicule. They walked back into their towns to find their neighbors waiting with pointed fingers and mocking laughter. The social shaming was swift and absolute. They were no longer the chosen few. They were the fools of the village, the cautionary tales told in taverns. This public humiliation was more painful than the failed prophecy itself. It stripped away their status, leaving them isolated and broken. The failure of the prediction was a private tragedy, but the social fallout was a public execution of their dignity. The human mind does not easily accept the death of a deeply held conviction. When the prophecy fails, the brain faces a violent internal friction known as cognitive dissonance. It is a psychological agony, a sharp, jarring disconnect between the world as it is and the world as it was promised to be. To resolve this, the mind does not simply discard the failed belief. It builds a fortress around it. The believer ignores the evidence, reinterprets the silence of the heavens, and finds new, hidden meanings in the very failure that should have shattered their faith. This is the paradox of the end times. The more a prediction is challenged by reality, the more fervently the believer clings to it. They seek out others who share their confusion, creating a closed loop of validation that reinforces the original error. Every doubt is framed as a test, every skepticism as a sign of the enemy. The failure becomes the catalyst for a deeper, more radical commitment. They are no longer just followers of a date. They are martyrs for a cause that has moved beyond the reach of logic. This mental architecture ensures that the prophecy survives the reality of the morning sun. It is not about the truth of the prediction, but about the desperate, human need to maintain a coherent narrative. The stage for these prophecies has shifted, but the script remains identical. We have traded the wrath of gods for the cold, calculated terror of the nuclear silo and the silent, creeping dread of a changing climate. Today, the end is not a date on a calendar, but a constant low-frequency hum of anxiety beneath the surface of daily life. We see it in the way headlines frame every natural disaster as a harbinger, every political tremor as the final crack in the foundation. The mechanism of fear has evolved to match our technological age, where once we looked to the stars for signs of our demise, we now look to data, models, and the relentless flow of global news to confirm our darkest suspicions. The modern mind, much like the ancient one, finds comfort in the structure of a catastrophe. It is easier to believe in a singular, world-ending event than to face the messy, unpredictable reality of a society in flux. We project our collective instability onto the horizon, waiting for a finality that never arrives. This is the cycle. We fear the future, we define the end, and when the world persists, we simply shift the goalposts to the next looming crisis. The music shifts, a low, rhythmic pulse that mirrors the relentless ticking of a clock. This is not a coincidence. It is a pattern. We are caught in a feedback loop where the fear of the end becomes the very engine that drives us toward it. Every time a new crisis emerges, the collective consciousness does not pause to analyze. It accelerates. It reaches for the same old scripts, the same tired warnings, and the same desperate need for a final resolution. This is the trap. We believe we are witnessing the collapse of history, but we are merely participating in a ritual that has played out for thousands of years. The pattern is seductive because it offers a false sense of clarity. If the end is coming, then the chaos of the present finally has a purpose. We find ourselves trapped in this inevitability, where every headline, every market fluctuation, and every geopolitical shift is interpreted through the lens of an approaching catastrophe. The more we fear the end, the more we act in ways that destabilize our own reality, creating the very conditions we claim to dread. We are not just predicting the end, we are building it. The cycle accelerates when the ground beneath us begins to shift. Look at the data. The sudden, sharp spikes in volatility that defy traditional economic logic. It starts in the margins, with empty storefronts, and the quiet shuttering of long-standing institutions. Then, the tension spills into the streets. We see it in the rapid, uncoordinated movements of crowds, the frantic pace of global trade, and the way information fractures into conflicting, high-intensity narratives. Every indicator of stability begins to fray. Market crashes are no longer just numbers on a screen. They are the physical manifestations of a collective loss of faith. When the currency loses its meaning, the fear of the end gains its power. We watch the news feeds scroll faster, the headlines growing more desperate, more absolute. The social fabric does not tear all at once. It unravels in a series of small, violent snaps. A protest here, a supply chain failure there, a sudden surge in migration. These are the tremors before the quake. The pressure is building, not because of a singular event, but because the system itself is reaching a point of exhaustion. We are witnessing the friction of a society trying to maintain its shape while the underlying structure gives way. The air grows heavy with the anticipation of a breaking point, and in that vacuum of certainty, the old dark prophecies find their perfect, fertile soil. The noise of the world is reaching a fever pitch, yet the air feels strangely thin. We are standing on a precipice where the familiar rules of cause and effect no longer apply. Every conversation carries a frantic, jagged edge. Every digital notification feels like a hammer blow against the glass of our collective sanity. The walls are closing in. We look for patterns in the chaos, but the patterns have dissolved into static. This is the final stage of the buildup, a profound, suffocating claustrophobia where the present moment feels too small to contain the mounting dread. The systems we built to protect us are now the very things that amplify our panic. We check the feeds, we watch the flickering screens, and we wait for the inevitable snap. Then, for a heartbeat, the noise stops. The frantic scrolling pauses. The global pulse seems to skip, leaving a vacuum of absolute, ringing silence. It is in this precise, hollowed-out space that the mind begins to reach for something older, something darker. The rational world has failed to provide answers, and the hunger for a final, apocalyptic explanation becomes an physical ache. We are ready for the end. We are waiting for the first voice to name it. The silence breaks with a single, jagged notification. It is not a headline, but a whisper that turns into a roar. A video, a screenshot, a fragmented text. The medium does not matter, only the message. It names the end with terrifying, absolute precision. Within minutes, the signal jumps from the fringes to the mainstream. It spreads through the digital architecture like a wildfire in a drought. Jumping from device to device, screen to screen, we see the metrics spike. Millions of views, billions of shares, the global conversation narrowing. The prophecy is no longer a fringe theory. It is the only thing that exists. It validates the panic we felt, giving a name to the invisible pressure. People stop questioning the source and start debating the timeline. The logic of the real world is discarded in favor of this new, apocalyptic narrative. It is a feedback loop of pure, unadulterated certainty. Every post, every comment, every shared image reinforces the belief that the clock has finally run out. We are a synchronized mass, staring into the mouth of a predicted catastrophe. The prophecy has ignited, and the world is burning in the light of its own manufactured end. The digital panic spills into the streets. It is no longer a conversation. It is a mass exodus from the mundane. In homes across the globe, the objects of a lifetime are discarded in hours. Furniture is left on curbs. Bank accounts are drained. And the long-held security of ownership is traded for the fleeting comfort of proximity to others. People are not just preparing for the end. They are actively dismantling their lives to meet it. The streets fill with the restless, the desperate, and the convinced. They move toward landmarks, open fields, and high ground, guided by the same viral coordinates that promised a final revelation. The frantic energy of the morning gives way to a heavy, pressurized stillness as the crowds coalesce. There is no commerce, no work, no routine. There is only the collective gaze, fixed on the horizon, waiting for the sky to break. Every face is a mirror of the same singular, terrifying expectation. They stand shoulder to shoulder, a sea of humanity stripped of its future, holding their breath as the final minutes tick down. We are at the edge of the map. The final seconds tick away in a rhythmic, synchronized pulse. Thousands of eyes are locked on watches, on screens, on the empty, indifferent sky. Then, the clock strikes 12. The sound of the chime ripples through the crowd, thin and lonely. It echoes against the buildings, dies out, and leaves behind a silence so dense it feels physical. No fire falls, no earth splits, no shadow descends. The air remains still. A bird chirps somewhere in the distance, a sound so mundane it feels like an insult. People look at each other, then back at the horizon, waiting for the delayed impact. But the horizon does not move. The stars do not blink. The world is exactly as it was a minute ago. Only now, it is stripped of its frantic, desperate purpose. A man drops his bag. The thud is deafening in the vacuum of expectation. A woman lowers her gaze, her shoulders sagging under the weight of an empty reality. The collective energy that held them upright evaporates, leaving behind a hollow, shivering confusion. There is no relief, only a profound, jagged sense of betrayal. The prophecy has failed, and in its place, a terrifying, quiet clarity takes hold. The world has not ended, but the illusion that kept them together has shattered, leaving them standing in the dark, exposed and utterly alone. The silence breaks, not with a shout, but with the frantic clicking of buttons. Phones are pulled from pockets, screens glowing with a harsh, artificial blue light in the dark. People huddle over devices, scrolling through forums and feeds, their fingers moving with a jagged, nervous intensity. They are looking for the error, a missed time zone, a leap second, a misread astronomical chart. The collective stillness dissolves into a low, rising hum of voices, each one demanding an explanation for the void. A man near the front shakes his device, tapping the glass until his knuckles turn white. He is not looking for the truth. He is looking for the math that will fix the reality he just lost. The shock is being replaced by a sharp, brittle agitation. Someone shouts a question into the night, demanding to know who miscalculated the alignment. The crowd begins to shift, turning on itself. The unified focus of the last hour, fracturing into thousands of individual, angry points of light. They pace in tight, aggressive circles, eyes scanning the faces of strangers for someone to blame. The air, once heavy with expectation, is now charged with a volatile, defensive heat. They refuse to accept the empty horizon. They are already rewriting the variables, desperate to find the hidden logic that will force the end to happen, even if it is only a few minutes late. The panic does not dissipate. It shifts. A woman standing on a concrete barrier holds her phone high, the screen glowing against the dark. She shouts a series of numbers, her voice cutting through the chaotic murmur of the crowd. The surrounding people stop their pacing. They turn toward her. The frantic energy in the air snaps into a singular, focused line. She is not admitting defeat. She is correcting the math. She points to a specific alignment of stars, a detail previously overlooked in the rush. The crowd presses in, bodies colliding in the cramped space, eyes wide and fixed on her device. They are no longer looking for an end that failed. They are looking for the start of the next one. A man near the front pulls out a pen, scribbling a new date onto the back of his hand. His movements are precise, almost surgical. The anger that fueled the previous minutes evaporates, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged certainty. The prophecy has not died. It has simply shed its skin. A ripple of nods moves through the mass of people. They begin to chant the new date, a rhythmic, low-frequency sound that vibrates in the chest. The logic of the calendar has been discarded. People are no longer reading data. They are consuming the sensation of the threat itself. A man drops his phone, the screen shattering against the pavement. But he does not look down. He is staring at the horizon, his pupils dilated, his breathing shallow and rapid. The fear is a physical weight, pulling his shoulders forward, locking his jaw. It is a biological override. When the evidence contradicts the prophecy, the brain does not stop. It accelerates. A woman nearby tears a page from a notebook, crumpling the calculations that prove the date wrong. She tosses the paper into the wind. She is not interested in the math. She is interested in the adrenaline. The crowd moves in a tight, pulsing wave, their movements synchronized by a shared, unspoken demand for catastrophe. They are hardwired to prioritize the threat over the fact. Every pulse of fear acts as a stimulant, sharpening their focus, narrowing their reality until only the impending end exists. The screaming stops. It does not fade. It is cut short by a sudden, collective realization. A man in the center of the square lowers his hands, his fingers trembling, his eyes scanning the faces around him. He is looking for a sign, not of the apocalypse, but of a reason to keep standing. The silence that follows is heavier than the noise. Why do they demand the end? They do not want the world to burn. They want the world to be a story with a final, definitive chapter. Without the end, existence is a sprawling, unmanageable mess of accidents and entropy. With the end, there is a boundary. A woman picks up a discarded notebook, smoothing the crumpled pages against her palm. She is not looking for a date anymore. The fear was never the goal. The goal was the order that fear imposed on an otherwise indifferent universe. They need the end to make the beginning matter. They need the finality to justify the effort of the middle. The prophecy is not a warning. It is a frame. The noise of the crowd dissolves into the sound of wind moving through dry, hollow stone. We are back where we began, in the quiet ruins that predate the records of our current panic. A single shaft of light cuts through the dust, illuminating the jagged edges of a fallen pillar. The stone is worn smooth by time, yet the cracks follow the same jagged geometry as the broken glass of the modern city. This is the physical record of the burden. It is not a story written in ink, but in the slow, relentless erosion of structures that were once thought to be eternal. A hand touches the surface of a wall, tracing a groove carved by a tool that has been lost for centuries. The texture is cold, abrasive, and indifferent to the people who once stood here, waiting for their own version of the end. The cycle does not break, it merely shifts its weight from one generation to the next. The ruins remain, silent and heavy, holding the memory of every fear that has ever been projected. The mind does not build these visions to destroy itself. It builds them to survive. When the world presents a chaos that the senses cannot process, the imagination steps in to draw a line. It creates a boundary, a final act, a definitive stop. This is not a surrender to fear. It is a desperate, calculated act of cognitive preservation. A child draws a sun on a piece of paper, then draws a heavy black line across the bottom of the page. The line is not the end of the world. It is the edge of the paper, the limit of the space where the child can exert control. Humanity does the same with the concept of the end. By imagining the collapse, we map the limits of our own endurance. We test the weight of our survival against the hypothetical void. A hand reaches out, brushing away a layer of dust from a stone surface, revealing a mark that has survived the rise and fall of a dozen empires. The mark is a testament to the need to leave a record. The shaft of light that once cut through the ruins begins to narrow. It retreats across the stone floor, inch by inch, as if the sun itself is withdrawing from the scene. Dust motes that were dancing in the beam lose their illumination, falling back into the heavy, stagnant air. The edges of the pillars soften, then dissolve into the encroaching dark. There is no sudden collapse, no dramatic finality. There is only the slow, steady removal of visibility. We are left with the texture of the stone, cold and unyielding, and the silence that follows the light. The warning does not arrive with a roar. It persists in the quiet gaps between our certainties. It is the shadow that stretches long when the day is ending, yet never quite touches the feet of those who watch it. We wait for the end to arrive, to take form, to be something we can finally name and face. But the end is not a point on a map. It is the horizon. The light is gone now. The ruins are just shapes in the dark. The warning remains. It is always coming. It is never here.